The chandeliers had already been lit when the first whisper began to move. Not the kind of whisper that carries gossip, but the kind that shifts oxygen, the kind that makes silk sleeves stiffen and metals feel heavier against tailored coats. Inside Buckingham Palace, beneath ceilings painted with centuries of inherited certainty, a formal reception was unfolding with the precision of choreography learned before memory. Every movement, every glance, was measured against precedent. Portraits of sovereigns pass observed from gilt frames, their oil-painted eyes witnesses to rituals unchanged for generations. At the far end of the grand corridor, Queen Consort Camilla stood poised beneath the crest of the crown. Her posture was effortless but deliberate, the result of years spent navigating public scrutiny and private complexity. Silk the color of winter ivory fell cleanly from her shoulders. Jewels caught the light, refracting it across polished marble floors. It was her gathering, her authority, her evening, and then the doors opened. The sound was subtle, a muted hinge, a gloved hand withdrawing, but every spine aligned instinctively. A ripple of attention moved through ambassadors, dukes, military attaches, and senior household officers. Young Princess Charlotte of Wales entered the hall. Not hurried, not hesitant. She walked with the steady rhythm of a child raised within ceremony, but not consumed by it. Her pale blue sash rested diagonally across a tailored dress chosen carefully by aides weeks in advance. The selection had been discussed in private briefings. Symbolism matters, even at 9 years old. Behind her, two ladies-in-waiting maintained distance. Farther still, a line of royal guards in ceremonial red stood motionless, scarlet against stone. Protocol was clear, at least on paper. When approaching the queen consort in a formal setting of this rank, a bow or curtsy is expected. It is not theatrical, it is structural. A gesture that affirms order. A gesture that sustains visible hierarchy. Charlotte slowed as she reached the marked position embedded invisibly within the marble, a point every member of the household recognized though no line was drawn. The room quieted. A faint rustle of fabric, the tick of a distant clock. Camilla inclined her head slightly. Not yet a smile, but an invitation to one. Charlotte looked up. Her expression was calm, thoughtful, not rebellious, not confused, simply resolved. Seconds lengthened. No curtsy came. The silence deepened, not awkward, but electric, the kind that hums against chandeliers and vibrates beneath polished shoes. An aide shifted weight almost imperceptibly. Another inhaled. But before any correction could form, before protocol officers could step forward with discreet instruction, something else moved. From the right flank of the corridor, a royal guard broke alignment. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was precise. One step, then another. Measured boots against marble. Discipline made audible. He positioned himself half a pace behind and slightly to the side of Charlotte. Not obstructing her, not shielding her, but unmistakably aligned with her presence. The message was subtle, but in a palace trained to read subtleties, it was seismic. He had chosen placement. He had chosen proximity. He had chosen a side. No command had been spoken, no signal given. Yet centuries of reflex were being quietly interrogated in real time. Camilla's eyes flickered, not with anger, but calculation, because this was no longer a child hesitating. This was hierarchy encountering instinct, and instinct refusing to kneel. The air shifted. Somewhere in the hall, a senior equerry felt the moment fracture, not visibly, but structurally. The invisible scaffolding of rank trembled. Charlotte's chin remained level. Her hands rested gently at her sides. Not defiance, not submission. Presence. The guard's gloved fingers remained at the seam of his coat, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his bearskin cap. But his stance was unmistakable. Protective alignment. Across the corridor, a court historian would later recall that the portraits of Queen Elizabeth II seemed almost luminous in that pause, as if memory itself leaned closer. Seconds passed. Camilla allowed a measured breath to settle between them. She understood optics. She understood that authority sometimes strengthens through restraint. "Good evening, Charlotte," she said softly. Her voice did not waver. Charlotte responded with composure beyond her years. "Good evening." Nothing more. No correction. No insistence. The exchange concluded, outwardly, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, but within the palace's internal circuitry, alarms had already begun to hum, because protocol had not merely been delayed, it had been declined, and a guard, sworn to neutrality, had stepped into alignment with the future line of succession. As the reception resumed its orchestrated rhythm, conversations restarted with fragile politeness. Crystal touched crystal. Diplomats resumed their murmured negotiations. But beneath the music and measured smiles, something irreversible had entered the bloodstream of the evening. Hours later, in quieter corridors behind public grandeur, discussions began. Was the curtsy formally mandated for a direct heir's child in the presence of the queen consort? Had the expectation been ceremonial assumption or written directive? And why had the guard intervened without visible instruction? Inside the royal guard's private chamber, the officer removed his cap with deliberate calm. His name would not appear in headlines. His record was disciplined, decorated, unblemished. He understood oath. He understood allegiance, not to individuals, but to the crown itself. And the crown, he knew, was not merely a person standing beneath chandeliers. It was a line, a legacy, a future. He had seen Charlotte hesitate not with uncertainty, but with understanding. A child trained carefully in constitutional nuance. A child aware that gestures shape optics. Optics shape perception. And perception shapes legitimacy. The guard did not act impulsively. He acted protectively. Outside, the Union flag stirred against the darkening sky. Within, palace secretaries began cross-referencing precedence charts dating back generations. Because if the bow was never formally required, then the moment was not insubordination. It was clarification. But if it was required, then something far more complicated had occurred. The camera drifts now through lamplit corridors, past portraits, past sealed doors where history is archived and amended quietly. In one such chamber, an elderly archivist retrieves a leather-bound volume. Ceremonial directives concerning minors in direct succession. Dust lifts, pages turn. A notation, faint, nearly overlooked, suggests that heirs' children are instructed in discernment before gesture. That visible deference must never obscure inherited standing. It is not bolded. It is not public, but it exists. Back in her private sitting room, Camilla removes her gloves slowly. Her reflection in the mirror is composed, but thoughtful. She has lived long enough within scrutiny to understand that power is rarely tested by noise. It is tested by silence. Charlotte's silence had not been chaotic. It had been deliberate, and the guard's alignment, equally so. Elsewhere in the palace, aides draft internal memos requesting clarification without accusation. Language is careful, neutral, institutional, because nothing publicly occurred, and yet everything shifted. Near midnight, Charlotte is escorted quietly back to her residence wing. She asks no dramatic questions. She offers no explanation. When her lady-in-waiting gently inquires if she understood the expectation, Charlotte replies simply, yes. No elaboration, only certainty. Outside, London continues unaware. Traffic hums beyond palace gates. Headlines focus on policy and politics. But inside these gilded walls, an ancient system recalibrates. The guard stands watch again the next morning, as if nothing has changed. His posture is impeccable, his record intact. But within the palace's silent memory, his step into alignment has been logged, not as rebellion, as interpretation. The echo of boots on marble that evening was not disruption. It was conscience made visible. And in the polished heart of monarchy, conscience could be more destabilizing than protest. The chandeliers dim, the corridor empties, the marble cools. Yet the space where Charlotte stood seems to hold a faint imprint, as if the stone itself remembers, because what occurred was not a child refusing courtesy. It was a generational inflection point, a future sovereign learning, perhaps instinctively, that dignity does not always kneel, and a guard recognizing that duty is not blind obedience, but fidelity to the line that outlives any single reign. The palace sleeps, but its foundations, centuries deep, have felt the tremor, and somewhere within its archives, beneath ink and parchment, the question waits, was a bow ever truly required? Or was this moment always destined to arrive? The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of that unoffered curtsy still lingered. Not in the marble, but in memory. By morning, Buckingham Palace had resumed its outward calm. Carriages came and went. Press briefings moved forward. Flags rose precisely at scheduled hours. To the public eye, nothing had shifted. Inside the machinery of monarchy, however, quiet recalibration had begun. Because within this institution, protocol is not decorative. It is constitutional choreography. Hours after the reception, a sealed memorandum was delivered to the office of the Lord Chamberlain. Its language was restrained. Clarification requested regarding ceremonial precedents involving minors within the direct line of succession when in proximity to the Queen Consort. No accusation, no urgency, but the phrasing alone carried weight. To understand why, one must step back, beyond last evening's corridor, beyond personal interpretation, and into the architecture of royal hierarchy itself. The British monarchy is not sustained by sentiment. It is sustained by statute, precedent, and layered interpretation. In 1701, the Act of Settlement 1701 established parameters that still ripple through succession today. Its language was rigid, its intent unmistakable. The crown passes through defined Protestant lineage. Rank is not negotiated. It is inherited. But inheritance alone does not govern behavior. That is where precedence enters. Within the palace archives exists a series of leather-bound volumes, the court precedence tables. They are not published for casual study. They are consulted quietly, revised carefully, and interpreted conservatively. Every bow, every curtsy, every placement in procession is documented. Yet even documentation carries nuance. By mid-morning, senior clerks had assembled in a chamber lined with portraits, including that of Queen Elizabeth II, whose reign spanned 70 years and whose adherence to constitutional subtlety remains a modern benchmark. One clerk, spectacles low against his nose, traced a finger along a footnote dated 1958. Another cross-referenced a 1981 ceremonial update issued during a state visit. The question was simple. Was a child in the direct line, the daughter of the Prince of Wales, required to curtsy to the Queen Consort in a formal but non-state setting? The answer was not simple, because the Queen Consort by title holds precedence immediately after the sovereign, yet the Prince of Wales, and by extension his children, represent the future embodiment of the crown itself. Ceremony must reinforce present authority, but it must never diminish future legitimacy. That tension, invisible to the public, is where institutions strain. Meanwhile, in a smaller chamber overlooking the quadrangle, the royal guard who stepped forward the previous evening sat alone with file marked confidential, oath and alignment. He was not summoned with urgency. He was not reprimanded. He was asked to submit a written explanation. His record preceded him. Tours completed, commendations earned, discretion demonstrated. His oath, like all within his unit, was sworn not to an individual, but to the crown as an enduring entity. And therein lay the moral hinge. If the crown is both present sovereign and future sovereign in continuity, then protection extends beyond current embodiment. His explanation was brief. Positioning was undertaken to maintain equilibrium of perceived dignity within the line of succession. No verbal or physical obstruction occurred. Alignment was protective, not oppositional. Equilibrium of perceived dignity. The phrase would circulate internally for weeks. Elsewhere, Queen Consort Camilla received her own briefing. Her private secretary summarized findings without embellishment. Camilla listened without interruption. She had navigated decades of public scrutiny. She understood optics intimately, how a gesture can define a narrative, how silence can control one. What is the written directive? She asked finally. The secretary hesitated. There's expectation, ma'am, but no explicit mandate concerning minors in direct succession. Expectation, not mandate. The distinction was surgical. Meanwhile, the Prince and Princess of Wales were informed through secure channels. Prince William received the report in his private study, its language measured but unmistakable. He read it twice, then set it down. Across the room, Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood near a window overlooking winter gardens. She understood immediately that this was not about etiquette. It was about inheritance. She knew what she was doing, Catherine said quietly. William nodded. Charlotte's education had never been theatrical. It had been deliberate. She had been taught, gently, progressively, the invisible scaffolding that holds monarchy upright, not dominance. Balance. And balance requires discernment. Back in the archives, an overlooked advisory memorandum surfaced. It dated to the late years of Elizabeth II's reign, drafted during discussions about modernizing royal presentation in an age of instantaneous media. Its language was almost philosophical. Heirs shall be instructed not merely in gesture, but in the optics of gesture. Deference, when misapplied, may suggest inversion of continuity. Inversion of continuity. The phrase landed heavily, because a curtsy in isolation is simple, but in symbolism it is decoration. By afternoon, institutional review expanded. Precedence charts were examined not only for clarity, but for omission. Legal counsel quietly confirmed that no statute, including the Act of Settlement, dictates ceremonial gestures. Ceremony exists in custom. Custom evolves. But evolution must be invisible to remain stable. Hours later, in a corridor rarely photographed, the guard was summoned not for discipline, but for conversation. A senior officer asked only one question. Did you believe the dignity of the line was at risk? The guard did not hesitate. Yes, sir. Was your action political? No, sir. Personal? No, sir. Constitutional? A pause. Protective. The distinction again. Not constitutional overreach. Not personal opinion. Protection. Protection of continuity. That evening, Palace Communications drafted contingency language in case inquiries emerged externally. They would not confirm debate. They would emphasize unity. But internally, a recalibration was already underway. Ceremonial guidance regarding minors would be reviewed. Quietly. No announcement. No headline. Because monarchy survives not by loud reform, but by precise adjustment. The camera drifts now through portrait-lined halls, past the image of Elizabeth II in coronation regalia, past historical depictions of Queen's consort who navigated influence without sovereign authority. History offers precedent for tension between present power and future line, yet rarely has it unfolded in such distilled stillness. Charlotte, meanwhile, continued her studies without visible disruption. Tutors arrived. Lessons proceeded. Her routine remained intact. But those responsible for shaping her understanding adjusted their emphasis subtly. Discernment was no longer theoretical. It had been exercised. At dusk, the Union flag lowered against a dimming sky. Palace windows reflected fading light. The institution breathed, not fractured, but aware. In a final internal review before midnight, a notation was added to ceremonial guidance. Minors within the direct line of succession shall be instructed in situational discretion regarding gestures of deference toward non-sovereign senior members. It was carefully phrased. It altered nothing publicly, yet it altered everything structurally, because the expectation had never been codified, and what is not codified can be clarified. Queen Consort Camilla retired that night, not diminished, but contemplative. Authority exercised through restraint can sometimes appear stronger than enforcement. William, in his own residence, stood briefly at his daughter's doorway. She slept undisturbed, the calm of childhood intact. He understood that monarchy does not belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to continuity. And continuity sometimes requires a child to stand still. The guard returned to duty the following morning. No reprimand. No commendation. His stance was as precise as ever, but within the palace's internal record, his explanation remained filed, not as dissent, but as interpretation grounded in oath. The way to protocol is rarely visible. It exists in inked margins, in archived footnotes, in silences chosen over correction. And now, beneath chandeliers and within sealed memoranda, one small irregularity had revealed something profound. Expectation is not mandate. Custom is not statute, and dignity, when understood correctly, does not always require visible submission. But as the review concluded, a final detail surfaced, a marginal annotation in an older handbook dated decades prior. It read, Direct heirs and their progeny shall not be compelled to enact gestures that symbolically subordinate inherited continuity. The line had never been removed. It had simply been forgotten. And that forgotten sentence reframed everything. The notation should have ended the matter. Instead, it intensified it. By the time the marginal clause surfaced, that quiet sentence buried decades deep within ceremonial guidance. The palace had already begun to divide along invisible seams. Not publicly. Not even vocally, but in glances, in pauses, in how long a door remained open before being closed. Inside Buckingham Palace, marble does not crack audibly. It absorbs pressure. It carries it silently beneath polished surface. And now there was pressure. The archivist's discovery. Direct heirs and their progeny shall not be compelled to enact gestures that symbolically subordinate inherited continuity. Was not a declaration. It was a memory. But memory, inside monarchy, is authority. The clause had never been repealed. It had never been amended. It had simply been eclipsed by assumption. An assumption, when institutionalized, can become more rigid than law. By mid-morning, senior aides gathered in a chamber seldom used except for internal arbitration. Heavy drapes muted the winter light. A long oak table divided the room not by sides, but by perspective. At one end sat the private secretary, to Queen Consort Camilla, calm, precise, loyal to present authority. At the other, representatives from the household of Prince William. Between them lay the document. No raised voices. No theatrical conflict. But the tension was surgical. The expectation, Camilla's secretary began carefully, has long been understood as uniform. Understood, William's aide replied, but not codified. Silence followed, because an institution's built on precedent. The distinction between understanding and codification is enormous. If something is written, it binds. If it is assumed, it can be reinterpreted. And reinterpretation was precisely what the royal guard had enacted. Meanwhile, whispers had begun moving through lower corridors. Not gossip, analysis. Was the guard's positioning an act of loyalty to the heir's line? Or an implicit challenge to the queen consort standing, in a private sitting room overlooking the inner courtyard? Camilla listened to the summary once more. She did not interrupt. She had learned over decades that reaction shapes narrative faster than event. Was there disrespect? She asked finally. No, ma'am. Was there obstruction? No, ma'am. Was there precedent? A pause. Yes, ma'am. The word hung. Precedent is monarchy's spine. Without it, ceremony collapses into personality. Across the palace, in a smaller, sunlit chamber, William and Catherine, Princess of Wales reviewed the same clause. Catherine traced a margin with her finger. She was taught this, she said softly. William nodded. Charlotte's education had never been improvised. It had been structured, carefully layered lessons about hierarchy, optics, and the psychology of symbolism. She had been taught that gestures are not merely polite. They are political. And political gestures, when enacted by those closest to the crown's future embodiment, can reshape perception. She did not refuse, William said quietly. She discerned. Elsewhere, the royal guard stood at attention outside a formal briefing. He had not sought attention. He had not anticipated scrutiny. Yet his decision had forced the palace to articulate something preferred to leave unspoken. Where exactly does present authority end and future sovereignty begin? The guard was summoned again, this time before a smaller review council. Not disciplinary, clarificatory. A senior officer addressed him directly. When you stepped forward, what did you perceive? A shift in expectation, the guard replied. Clarify. I perceived a gesture that, if enacted, could symbolically invert visible continuity. The phrase echoed the archival clause almost precisely. You believe the dignity of the future line required reinforcement? Yes, sir. Even at risk of misinterpretation? Yes, sir. No tremor in his voice. Only oath, because his loyalty was not to the figure beneath chandeliers. It was to the crown as entity, past, present, future unified. And that is where institutions grow uncomfortable. By afternoon, closed-door discussions intensified. Camilla's advisors argued that visible uniformity prevents speculation, that deviation, however justified, invites narrative. William's household countered that forced symbolism risks long-term erosion of perceived legitimacy. Neither side sought confrontation. Both sought stability. But stability requires alignment. And alignment had fractured, subtly, when a child remained upright. Hours later, a discreet meeting was arranged between Camilla and William. No press, no record beyond standard scheduling. The room was modest compared to state chambers. Firelight flickered against dark wood paneling. The atmosphere was measured. Camilla spoke first. "I understand the clause," she said evenly, "but perception must be considered." William met her gaze. So must continuity. No accusation. No hostility. Just reality. Charlotte, in another wing of the palace, practiced piano scales without awareness of the institutional recalibration unfolding around her. The notes echoed gently through high ceilings. Innocent, disciplined, precise. Yet even innocence carries consequence when born into monarchy. Back in the arbitration chamber, legal advisors examined additional materials. They found no statute contradicting the archival clause, no directive mandating uniform courtesy from heirs' children. The expectation had been cultural, reinforced by repetition. But culture, unlike law, evolves. The discovery reframed the event entirely. Charlotte had not broken protocol. She had exercised sanctioned discretion, and the guard had not challenged authority. He had upheld written memory. But what followed next complicated everything. A senior aide produced correspondence from decades earlier, advisory letters exchanged during the final years of Queen Elizabeth II. The letters discussed preparing heirs for modern visibility, cautioning against gestures that could blur structural clarity. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. The monarchy had anticipated this tension long before it materialized. By evening, the palace faced a decision. Discipline the guard quietly, reinforcing uniform expectation, or acknowledge the clause, refining ceremonial guidance without public spectacle. Either path carried consequence. Discipline would suggest that precedent is malleable under present preference. Acknowledgement would suggest that tradition must occasionally correct itself. In a final review before dusk, one senior advisor voiced what others had avoided. If we punish alignment with written precedent, we risk weakening the very structure we defend. The words settled heavily. Because monarchy does not survive by denying its own archives. It survives by interpreting them wisely. The camera drifts now through marble corridors once more. The line where Charlotte had paused is invisible, yet permanent. A line not etched in stone, but drawn in understanding. That night, Camilla stood alone briefly before a portrait of Elizabeth II. The painted sovereign's gaze was steady, composed by decades of constitutional restraint. Camilla understood something profound in that silence. Authority enforced can appear brittle. Authority exercised with discernment can endure. In William's residence, Charlotte asked only one question before sleep. Did I do something wrong? William knelt beside her. No, he said gently. You stood where you belong. She accepted the answer without drama, because children raised within monarchy learn early that belonging is not entitlement. It is responsibility. By midnight, the decision was nearly formed. The guard would not be disciplined. The clause would not be publicly highlighted. Ceremonial guidance would be adjusted subtly to clarify discretion for minors in direct succession. No announcement, no spectacle, but a recalibration nonetheless. And in that recalibration, something else shifted. The palace acknowledged quietly that hierarchy is not merely vertical. It is temporal. Present authority and future sovereignty must coexist without symbolic contradiction. Charlotte's stillness had illuminated that fault line, and the guard step had drawn it clearly. The marble floor had not cracked, but a line, invisible yet unmistakable, now divided assumption from precedent. The question was no longer whether a child should curtsy. It was whether the institution would honor its own memory. As dawn approached, London stirred beyond iron gates. Within the palace, documents were amended, language softened, expectation clarified, and a truth settled like early light across stone. Dignity inherited cannot be symbolically lowered without consequence. The decision, once shaped, did not echo. It settled, like dust after movement. Within Buckingham Palace, consequences rarely arrive with announcement. They appear instead as adjustments, small relocations of responsibility, subtle amendments to schedule, invitations extended or quietly withdrawn. By morning, the royal guard at the center of the corridor incident had received formal notice, not reprimand, not commendation, reassignment, temporary rotation to a heritage protection detail. Still honorable, still visible, but removed from the daily interior choreography of the palace. The language was exact. Rotation enacted in alignment with operational equilibrium. Equilibrium again. The word now threaded through memoranda, like a silent refrain. He accepted the notice without visible reaction. A soldier does not question rotation orders. Yet he understood what this meant. He would not stand in that corridor again. Not soon. And perhaps that was the cost of interpretation. Meanwhile, in her private sitting room overlooking the palace gardens, Queen Consort Camilla read the final advisory summary. The fire was low. Afternoon light diffused through tall windows, blurring the world beyond glass. The report was precise. The archival clause remains valid. No statute mandates uniform courtesy for minors in direct succession. Guidance updated to reflect discretionary instruction. No blame assigned. No victory declared. But something irreversible had been acknowledged. Camilla set the document aside and remained seated longer than usual. For decades, her public life had unfolded under scrutiny sharpened by comparison. Comparison to history, to memory, to the enduring silhouette of Princess Diana. She had learned resilience through silence. Now she faced a quieter challenge, one not of scandal, but of symbolism. Charlotte's stillness had not diminished her authority, but it had revealed its boundaries. And boundaries, once visible, cannot be unseen. Across the palace, in a study lined with constitutional texts, Prince William stood before a portrait of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. He had often sought steadiness there. Elizabeth's reign had been defined by calibration, never allowing personal sentiment to fracture institutional integrity. William understood now that leadership within monarchy is less about assertion and more about balance. He had not instructed Charlotte to refuse. He had not scripted the moment, but he recognized it as inevitable. He turned as Catherine. Princess of Wales entered quietly. They reassigned him, she said softly. William nodded once. Not punishment. No, Catherine agreed, but not without cost. Silence filled the space between them. They both understood the moral complexity. The guard had acted in alignment with written memory. The palace had responded in alignment with institutional stability. No villain, no hero, only consequence. Elsewhere, deep within the archival wing, a sealed advisory document surfaced, one rarely requested. Its heading dated back nearly 3 decades. The subject line read, Optics of Succession in Transitional Eras. The memorandum had been commissioned during a period of intense public scrutiny, a time when the monarchy faced questions not of law, but legitimacy. It cautioned, heirs must be educated in the discernment of symbolic thresholds. A gesture enacted prematurely or inappropriately may reframe perceived authority. Symbolic thresholds. The phrase resonated through the chamber like distant thunder. Charlotte had not crossed a threshold. She had paused at one. And in that pause, forced the institution to examine itself. That evening, a discreet gathering convened in what is known internally as the Privy Chamber, a room seldom photographed, never televised. No official minutes would reflect the conversation fully, but the participants understood the gravity. Present were senior household advisors, constitutional counsel, and representatives of both the sovereign's and heirs' offices. At the center of the table lay the revised ceremonial guidance. One advisor voiced a concern that lingered beneath formal language. If this becomes narrative, it risks framing division. Another responded calmly. If we suppress clarification, we risk eroding credibility. The debate was not heated. It was weighted, because monarchy survives by appearing seamless. And seams, once noticed, demand stitching. After prolonged deliberation, the decision was unanimous. No public acknowledgement. No disciplinary record. The reassignment would stand. The guidance revision would remain internal, and the moment would be allowed to fade naturally from collective memory. But privately, internally, a lesson had been recorded. The guard, now stationed at a heritage estate outside London, walked the perimeter under grey skies. The air there was quieter, the duties less visible. Yet he felt no resentment. His oath had not changed. Protection is not measured by proximity to chandeliers. It is measured by fidelity to continuity. Inside the palace, Camilla attended engagements with measured composure. Her public demeanor remained unaltered, gracious, attentive, steady. But in rare private moments, she reflected on something deeper. Authority inherited through marriage carries different weight than authority inherited through blood. She had navigated public skepticism before. Now she navigated internal recalibration. Neither threatened her position, but both reminded her of monarchy's delicate architecture. One evening, long after formal duties concluded, William visited the corridor where the moment had occurred. The marble floor gleamed under low light. No mark indicated where Charlotte had stood. Yet he could see it clearly. A line not carved, but understood. He considered the cost of leadership. Sometimes leadership requires stepping forward. Sometimes it requires standing still. And sometimes it requires allowing silence to speak. In her residence wing, Charlotte practiced her reading aloud. Her voice carried faintly through the corridor, steady, thoughtful. She did not dwell on the reception. Children raised within monarchy learn quickly that certain conversations conclude without ceremony. But something within her had settled as well. She had felt the expectation. She had chosen alignment with what she understood, not rebellion, recognition. The palace, in turn, had chosen restraint over assertion, a quiet correction. Days passed. Media interest never materialized. No photograph captured attention. No headline questioned the gesture. Externally, nothing had happened. Internally, everything had been examined. In the Privy Chamber, the revised guidance was sealed within a leather folio marked ceremonial adjustments, minor succession. It would not be consulted often, but it would remain, and future aides, decades from now, would find it, and perhaps trace its origin back to a quiet child standing in a corridor. Late one evening, Camilla walked alone through a dim hallway, past portraits of Queen's consort who had navigated influence without sovereign authority. Each face carried its own story of proximity to power. She paused briefly before one painting, studying the brushstrokes, then continued walking. She understood now that authority need not be enforced to endure. It must simply be recognized, and sometimes recognition arrives through challenge. Meanwhile, the guard received a final private communication from his commanding officer. It contained only one sentence. Your conduct reflected fidelity to continuity. No praise, no elaboration, but acknowledgement. And acknowledgement within military structure is enough. As winter deepened, the palace returned fully to routine. Engagements, briefings, ceremonies, all resumed their measured rhythm. Yet beneath that rhythm lay a recalibrated awareness. Hierarchy had not weakened. It had clarified. And clarity, though invisible, fortifies foundation. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, William and Catherine watched their children play in the gardens beyond palace walls. Laughter rose into cold air. For a moment, there was no protocol, no archival clause, only family. Yet even in that simplicity, monarchy endured, not as spectacle, but as continuity. The camera drifts once more through stone corridors, across marble floors, into chambers where decisions are made without witness. Shadows lengthen. Firelight flickers. Behind every throne lies interpretation. Behind every gesture lies meaning. And sometimes, behind stillness lies the most profound assertion of all. The irreversible choice made in the Privy Chamber would never appear in public record, but it would shape future ceremonies quietly. Because monarchy is not preserved through rigidity. It is preserved through discernment. The storm never reached the horizon. From the outside, the palace remained immaculate, unchanged beneath winter sky. Carriages arrived on schedule, footmen aligned in perfect symmetry. The Union flag lifted and lowered with mechanical certainty above Buckingham Palace. But inside, something subtle had been corrected, not reversed, not exposed, corrected. Days after the Privy Chamber concluded its deliberation, revised ceremonial guidance was circulated discreetly among senior household officers. It arrived without commentary, a slim folio stamped with internal classification markings. Its language was careful. Minors within the direct line of succession shall exercise situational discretion regarding gestures of deference toward non-sovereign senior members, in alignment with continuity of the crown. No mention of Charlotte, no reference to the corridor, yet everyone who needed to understand understood. The correction was not loud. It was structural, and structural adjustments rarely seek applause. Meanwhile, the royal guard whose step had drawn invisible lines across marble completed his rotation, paperwork. The reassignment to Heritage Protection Detail would last 6 months, standard duration, officially routine. Unofficially, it served as equilibrium. His final morning within the palace interior was uneventful. He stood his watch with identical precision, boots polished, uniform immaculate, no farewell ceremony, no visible recognition. But as he handed over position to the incoming guard, their gloved hands met in firm clasp, soldier to soldier. The message was wordless. Duty understood. Outside London, the heritage estate he now protected carried a different silence. Rolling fields, ancient stone walls, a chapel whose bells rang at dusk. Protection here was less visible, yet perhaps more enduring, because the crown's continuity does not reside only within gilded halls. It resides in land, in memory, in history unbroken. Back inside the palace, Queen Consort Camilla adjusted her schedule without disruption. Public engagements continued. Charitable appearances unfolded with familiar warmth. Cameras captured composure. If she felt a recalibration, she did not display it. Authority maintained through grace can be more persuasive than authority asserted through correction. In a private moment between appointments, Camilla reread the advisory clause discovered in the archives. The sentence had been underlined lightly in pencil, not by her hand, but by one of the archivists who rediscovered it. Shall not be compelled. The wording did not weaken her position. It defined its boundary. She closed the folio slowly. Acceptance in institutions such as this is rarely theatrical. It is internal. Across the courtyard, in the residence wing of the Prince and Princess of Wales, Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales received confirmation that the matter had been resolved. No further review. No formal censure. Ceremonial guidance amended. William exhaled, not in triumph, but in relief. Victory was never the objective. Stability was. Catherine folded the memorandum neatly before placing it in a secure drawer. Will she know? She asked quietly. William considered. She already does. Charlotte had not asked again about the reception. She resumed her studies, her routines, her lessons in history and governance. Tutors adjusted emphasis slightly. More discussion about symbolism, about how perception shapes constitutional strength. But there was no lecture about defiance, because it had not been defiance. It had been discernment. One afternoon, during a history lesson, Charlotte paused over a passage describing the early reign of Queen Elizabeth II. She didn't choose to be queen, Charlotte observed. No, her tutor replied gently, but she chose how to be one. The distinction lingered. Choice within inheritance. That is where dignity lives. Meanwhile, the palace communications office performed its own quiet adjustment. Draft ceremonial briefings for upcoming events were amended with a new footnote. A single line reminding aides to consult succession status before advising minors on gestures of deference. Again, no explanation attached, just clarity, because confusion left unresolved breeds narrative. Clarity, even unseen, prevents fracture. Weeks passed. The corridor where Charlotte had stood returned fully to routine. Diplomats crossed its length. State guests admired its symmetry. No one paused the invisible line. But within institutional memory, that line remained, not as conflict, as calibration. The Royal Guard, now stationed beyond London's perimeter, walked evening rounds beneath frost-touched hedgerows. The estate's chapel bell marked the hour, with resonant calm. He did not regret his step, nor did he romanticize it. He had acted according to oath. The rest belonged to the institution. One evening, as dusk settled, he received a brief internal communique. It contained no decorative phrasing, rotation acknowledged, conduct recorded, as aligned with continuity protocol. That was all. Within military culture, acknowledgement without embellishment signals respect. He folded the note carefully and placed it within his personal file. Inside the palace, Camilla hosted a smaller reception. Intimate, restrained. Charlotte attended as well. When they encountered one another, the exchange was measured and calm. "Good evening, Charlotte," Camilla said. "Good evening," Charlotte replied. No curtsy, no pause heavy with tension, simply acknowledgement. And in that simplicity lay resolution, because the correction had been absorbed. Hierarchy remained intact. Continuity remained clear. No humiliation, no triumph, only balance restored. In the weeks that followed, palace historians quietly updated internal annotations to reflect the archival clause's reaffirmation. Future scholars reviewing ceremonial evolution would see the footnote and note its date. They would not know the corridor's silence, but they would see the correction. William, walking alone one evening to the gardens. Consider how fragile institutions appear from a distance, and how resilient they become through thoughtful restraint. Monarchy does not adapt through spectacle. It adapts through discretion. Charlotte joined him briefly, her breath visible in cold air. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said softly. "Everything is exactly as it should be." And for now, it was because the palace had chosen not to discipline discernment. It had chosen not to inflate tension. It had chosen equilibrium. In the Heritage Estate Chapel, candlelight flickered against stone. The guard paused briefly during his patrol, listening to wind against ancient walls. Protection is not always visible. Sometimes it is simply presence. Back in London, the palace settled into its winter rhythm. Snow traced the edges of iron gates. Tourists gathered at a distance. Life continued. But inside those walls, something fundamental had been clarified. Loyalty is not blind obedience. It is fidelity to continuity. The quiet correction ensured that no future child in direct succession would face ambiguous expectation at a symbolic threshold. It ensured that dignity inherited would not be unintentionally obscured, and it ensured that authority, when challenged by memory, could respond with grace rather than force. The corridor remains polished. The chandeliers remain luminous. But beneath them now lies a deeper understanding, one that required no proclamation. Because the strongest institutions do not shout when they recalibrate. They adjust and endure. The corridors of Buckingham Palace had returned to their outward calm. Chandeliers sparkled, boots echoed on polished marble, and ceremonial rehearsals continued as though the moment had never happened. Yet, the echo of what had transpired lingered invisibly, like the faint memory of a bell's toll across empty halls. It was a quiet truth. Power is inherited, but dignity is understood. And in that understanding, the institution reveals its subtle complexity. A child's stillness, a measured pause on the marble floor, had illuminated this in a way no decree or directive could. The royal guard, now stationed at his heritage post, patrolled ancient walls beneath the dim glow of lanterns. Each step was a meditation on duty, not obedience to individuals, but fidelity to the institution. Protection, he had learned, extends beyond the figurehead. It is service to continuity, to history, and to the future that will inherit the crown's weight long after the present generation departs. Within the palace, Camilla moved through her engagements with measured grace. Her authority, once quietly questioned, had found confirmation not in dominance but in restraint. Observation had become her instrument, patience her tool. Every handshake, every glance, every carefully composed posture contributed to the subtle architecture of legitimacy. She knew that influence does not demand a curtsy. It thrives in perception and recognition, in the acknowledgement of roles beyond the ceremonial. Meanwhile, Charlotte returned to her studies, her routine uninterrupted yet subtly informed by experience. She had observed the mechanics of hierarchy firsthand, internalizing the delicate dance of ceremony and continuity. Lessons on history, constitutional precedent, and the weight of lineage became more than academic exercises. They became instruction in judgment, discernment, and silent authority. in her quiet reflection, she began to grasp a truth that no adult had to explain. Loyalty is not measured by compliance. It is measured by understanding. From the palace windows, dusk painted the gardens in amber and indigo. The Union flag, lowered against the fading light, mirrored the balance between public perception and private knowledge. That flag, symbolic of the nation, seemed almost to bow in its own way to the invisible calibration that had occurred within the palace's walls. Charlotte's small act had ripple effects beyond immediate ceremony. It had reminded the institution that future sovereignty cannot be subordinated by present protocol. The royal guard, walking the perimeter of the heritage estate, paused to observe the winter sky. Stars pierced the darkening clouds, faintly illuminating the frost-laden earth. It was a reminder that guidance, protection, and fidelity often occur in spaces unseen. One's duty does not always demand acknowledgement. It demands awareness, presence, and moral clarity. Inside the palace, Camilla reflected on the layers of responsibility that extend far beyond public appearances. Authority, she realized, is both fragile and enduring. It thrives in the quiet acknowledgement of history, in careful observation of precedent, and in measured responses to challenges. Her thoughts wandered briefly to Charlotte, a child who would one day occupy a position demanding the same careful equilibrium. A child who had already begun to understand the gravity of inherited responsibility. Even as life continued, courtiers arrived, engagements commenced, carriages departed. The palace had absorbed a subtle shift. The corridors remained polished, the marble pristine, the chandeliers luminous. Yet beneath that exterior, something had changed irreversibly, an understanding that the future does not always bow easily, and that authority, to endure, must respect both legacy and discernment. And so, in the fading light of a winter evening, the story settled into reflection. The royal guard, the queen consort, the heir in miniature, each had played a role in a quiet recalibration that would echo across generations. The palace remained outwardly unchanged, yet internally wiser, because the crown endures not solely through inheritance, ceremony, or public perception. It endures through understanding, restraint, and the quiet fidelity of those who serve both past and future.